Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New York Historical Society. I am Louise Muir, New York Historical's president and CEO, and it really is a great thrill to see all of you in our beautiful Robert H. Smith Auditorium this evening. Tonight's program is presented as part of our History with David M. Rubenstein series, and we'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to Mr. Rubenstein for helping us to make history at New York Historical. Thank you. Now then, we are thrilled to welcome David M. Rubenstein back to New York Historical as moderator for this evening's program. Mr. Rubenstein is co-founder of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest private equity firms. Prior to co-founding the Carlyle Group, he practiced law for a number of years in New York. He also served as chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments. From 1977 to 1981, during the Carter administration, he was Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. Mr. Rubenstein occupies high-profile positions in the many cultural and educational institutions in which he is involved. For example, he serves as chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations and chairman of the Kennedy Center. We're also thrilled to welcome Tom Brokaw back to the New York Historical Society. Mr. Brokaw is one of America's most trusted and respected journalists. A recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2014, awarded by President Barack Obama, Mr. Brokaw served as anchor of NBC Nightly News from 1982 to 2004. He's currently a special correspondent for NBC News. For decades, Mr. Brokaw has reached millions of Americans in living rooms across the country to provide depth and analysis to historic moments as they unfold, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Apart from the Presidential Medal of Freedom, his reporting has been recognized with the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award and with 2 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Awards, 11 Emmys, and 2 Peabody Awards. Mr. Brokaw previously served as anchor of NBC's Today. Following the death of his close friend, Tim Russert, he took over Meet the Press during the 2008 campaign season. Mr. Brokaw has written 5 books, including The Greatest Generation, a title that gave name to those who served in World War II at home and abroad. And now, please do join me in welcoming David Rubenstein and Tom Brokaw.
Tom, thank you very much for coming. And when you were growing up in South Dakota, did you ever think that you would one day be the most prominent person in the broadcast world? You'd be living in New York, you'd get the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
No, I hoped to get to Minneapolis, actually, before I got to New York. I couldn't get a job in Minneapolis, so I had to come to New York, it turns out. I grew up in a real prairie culture. Both my parents came from poor stock. On my dad's side, very poor stock. His grandfather had gone west after the Civil War and established a tiny town in northern South Dakota and built a very kind of hard-scrabble railroading hotel there, a large family. My dad was 10 years old when the family effectively kind of walked away from him. He was on his own because everybody had to be at that stage. But he was a man of great resourcefulness. He had some learning disabilities in terms of reading, but if you had a mechanical piece in front of him, if it was broken, he could fix it and he could operate anything. And he took that and made it into a real skill set as a heavy equipment operator in construction, and wisely courted my mother, who came from the other end of the spectrum. She was from an Irish-American family. They were farmers. They were college-educated, many of them. And I'd often say to Mother, how did the two of you get together? And she really didn't have an answer, except as so many cases of relationships, it was intuitive. She took care of the kind of civilized part of the family with 3 boys and introduced us to books and good culture. My dad taught us how to do everything. Not that I did it very well, but he was there and made sure that we had the kind of hands-on experience that we would need. And I read my mother's diaries a few years ago. Think about this for a moment. They were married in 1938. Times were very, very tough. And she said we had one goal every year, which was to save $1,000. That was a lot of money to save on a really working class budget in those days. And the Depression really never left their sense of well-being. They were always worried that it would come again, but at the end of their lives, they enjoyed a wonderful time in California. And so it was a very rewarding experience for me to witness all that growing up and to see how things could go awry, but then how you can recover by doing the right thing.
So were you a high school student athlete or a scholar, or what were you in high school?
Well, I was kind of everything in high school. When I moved to this high school in 1955, I moved around a lot because we were in big construction jobs. It was a big town of Yankton, South Dakota. It was one of the bigger towns in the state. It was about 9,000 population at the time. The largest high school I'd ever been to. And as I walked up to the front door, I remember a young man coming out and yelling, "Auld is a cheerleader." It was the first time I'd heard of somebody called Meredith Auld. 54 years later, I've spent a lot of time with her, by the way. And
I was right down there.
I was a little overwhelmed by the size of the high school. But I was an athlete. I was a better basketball player than I was anything else. We had very competitive teams. I was active in student politics. And the famous story about me that they still like to tell is that we had a substitute teacher who came from the convent school in town, and she was very tough, and I was playing ball but also participating in debate. And so I took a quick break from my basketball and ran over to do a little something in debate. And I made it up on the way over there about what I was going to talk about. As I recall, it was something about military preparedness. I got up and winged it in a way that was not very persuasive. And all the little geeky debaters in the class were just, appalled by my performance. And Mrs. Holmes looked at me and said, "Brokaw, you're a fraud." And that has resonated for all these years from those debaters. They could still write to me about it.
So were you a one-and-done recruited to play college basketball and to go on to the NBA? Was that your...
No, I was not going to play college ball. I had a lot of other skills. I've often said I was among a small group of people in South Dakota recruited to take SAT tests, which couldn't get in South Dakota. You had to go to Minneapolis. There were 5 of us because Harvard allegedly was interested in us. So I've often spoken at Harvard, and I say I was one of those people who Harvard took a look at and decided that I wasn't up to their standards. So I've had to go through the rest of my life wondering what might have happened to me if I'd only had a Harvard education.
Originally went to the University of Iowa?
Went to the University of Iowa, went pretty much off the rails. I was kind of a whiz kid coming out of high school, thought I could just continue my success story. And I've often said that I used a couple of different lines. I had one major in beer and one in co-eds, kind of a double major in Pi Phis and Delta Gammas. Had a very good time. I didn't flunk out, but I didn't do very well. And so I left. I was going to go back. That didn't work because Meredith and I got together. But Iowa has stayed in touch with me, and it's been very gratifying. They have a wonderful school, one of those great Big Ten institutions, and a sensational library that they built about 10 years ago after a flood took out their old library. So they have a postmodern library, and they've taken all my papers and they've put them on, digitalized them, and they have a Tom Brokaw section built around the greatest generation. And that's been very gratifying. And my friends from my freshman year just look at me and laugh and say, "Who would have thought, Tom?"
Right.
This would happen.
So after your freshman year, you went back you went to the University of South Dakota?
I went to the University of South Dakota, but I continued my wayward ways. I dropped out for a while in 1960, a very exciting time in America. I was wandering around the Midwest, working as a disc jockey. My parents were very concerned about why I had kind of gone off the road. I thought I was fooling everybody. Meredith and I were not involved at that time at all, but she met my mother, and she was so distressed with my mother's anxiety that she wrote me a very harsh letter saying, "No one can understand what you're up to. We're very disappointed. I don't want to see you again. This is not what anyone could have expected of you," or something to that effect. And it was a turnaround. She got my attention, and I got my act together.
All right, so you graduated from the University of South Dakota, and then did you want to go into the highest calling of mankind, private equity, or what did you want to do?
Well, we got married, and I didn't even have a job the summer that we were getting married. And Meredith was kind of everything in South Dakota. So this was a match that surprised her friends and my friends. And I got a job, a starter job in Omaha, Nebraska, $100 a week. The apartment was, I don't know, $200 a month? Yeah, something like that. It was a terrible basement apartment. I remember that. Meredith got a teaching job, which helped. And I like to tell the story about her teaching job. She was graduated with honors, and she was teaching English at Omaha Central. And the head of the English department was Warren Buffett's aunt. And I've often said that we made the mistake of knowing the Buffett who could diagram a good sentence. We didn't know the one who could make you rich, it turns out. Anyhow, I learned a lot there in 2 years, and I got picked up unexpectedly by the biggest, most important station in the South, WSB in Atlanta. That led me to leaving the station at 11:30 at night, getting on a charter airplane, flying to wherever all hell was breaking out on the civil rights movement until NBC could get its own correspondents there. And after 6 months in Atlanta, NBC came and said, we want you to come to California. And that led me to California and NBC.
Had you ever been to California really before? Or?
I had not been there since I was 10 years old. And the interesting thing is I flew out in the summer of 1965. And California was not attractive in August in those days. It was smoggy and ugly, and the topless bars around. And we were living in Atlanta, which we loved a lot. And so I turned them down. And they thought I was a very clever negotiator. So they kept bumping up the salary and more opportunities. And our first child was born. And then we went to California, and it was a magical move for us. I arrived just in time to start covering Ronald Reagan running for governor of California. That was my first assignment at age 26, just having arrived there.
Did you think he was going to get elected?
I did think he was going to get elected governor. I didn't know at that point that he would go as far as he did, because he was still a little uneasy as a politician. I had watched him before when he was working for GE and doing other organized events. Very skillful performer, but he was not used to the press corps coming after him and questioning him and challenging him on things. But I've always said that the big secret, I thought, to Ronald Reagan was that he exuded a sense of optimism and cheerfulness. And the working class communities that had been traditionally Democrat in Southern California were tired of the students protesting all day, every day. They were getting a free education. There was no tuition at the university in those days. And they wanted to burn down the schools, and they were using a lot of profanity. And Ronald Reagan spoke for that crowd, for those people who didn't have education, college educations. And after about 9 months in office, there was a very clever, really smart politician on the Democratic side by the name of Jess Unruh, who was the head of the state legislature, he was the speaker, and he was as canny a guy as I've ever met. And I said to him, what do you think? He said, this SOB is a lot smarter than we realized. And he said, we can do business with him because he knows how to do business. And that's when I really began to have an idea that maybe he could go all the way.
Well, actually, Jess Unruh, when I was working in the Carter White House, Carter was running for re-election, Jess Unruh came and said, be careful what you wish for. Don't wish you're going to run against Ronald Reagan. He's very good. We said, no, he's so old. He's 69 years old. That's when I thought 69 was old. Now I'm 68. I think 69 is like a teenager. But he was a very good speaker, obviously, then. And did you get to know Ronald Reagan any?
I did, although, and I'm not the first one to say this, there were two Ronald Reagans. The Ronald Reagan that you saw in public, that cheerful bonhomie that he would have when he would, raise his hand and salute everybody and throw his arms around folks. And then the private Ronald Reagan was very, very private. Nancy, who I got to know very well, said to me at one point, there are times when I don't know what's going on with Ronnie. I think it had something to do with his childhood. His dad was a terrible drunk, and he got to a promised place. And then he really embraced being a thespian, being an actor. He knew what he needed to do, and he did it very, very skillfully. But he was not a man who gave himself up easily in private, unless he was with people he was really, really comfortable with. On the other hand, the last interview that he gave in the Oval Office was to me on the Friday before he left. It was very carefully orchestrated. I frankly think at the very end that he was beginning to lose some of his abilities. So they said, he'll sit down at 11:30, you got to finish right at noon, he'll thank the crew, he'll thank you. Then he wants to take you out onto the veranda. We don't know what that's about, but then he'll come back in and then it'll be over by 11:15 or by 12:15. So the interview went very well. It was about his childhood and how he was formed as a person, how he learned to read and what his aspirations were. And then when it was over, he said, "Tom, let's go out to the Rose Garden." I said, "Very good, Mr. President, let's do that." So we go out on the Rose Garden, and we're standing there, and suddenly a photographer appeared. And he said, "Tom, Nancy and I were talking about it this morning. You were there from the very beginning, weren't you?" And I said, "I was, Mr. President." He said, put his arm around me, and the camera started clicking. He said, "Worked out pretty well for both of us."
So, well, you were up close to him. Was that hair dyed? Was his hair dyed? That natural?
No, the thing about him, he would surprise you. I remember I had just come back from South America on a Sunday morning that the Super Bowl was going to be on, and I was going to be interviewing him before the Super Bowl. So he came down, typical Ronald Reagan kind of a 40s guy. He had red socks on because it was Christmas season, and he was very cheerful about it. And he had a couple of football stories to tell. And I said, "Mr. President, I've just been in Argentina and Brazil, and there's some interesting things." He gave me a 3-minute view of those two countries and what was going on with their economy and their politics. I mean, he just nailed it. And that kind of took me back a little bit because we didn't know which Ronald Reagan was going to show up from time to time.
So in your career, you're in L.A., you're happily living in L.A., all of a sudden NBC says, "Come and cover the White House." Did you want to do that?
Not particularly. I'd always wanted to cover the White House, but it was also in the middle of Watergate, and Dan Rather had a big head of steam at that point, and they were bringing me in to kind of not just cover the White House, but to stand up against Dan. And we had just built a house on the beach about 9 months earlier that had taken a long time to do on every dime that we had. I had a great life in California because I would cover national politics from there. I would go to the conventions, then I could go back to my good life in California. Meredith had a wonderful life out there. In fact, when we left, a columnist for the LA Times said it's fundamentally unfair that the wives have to follow their husbands where they're going when Meredith has such a standing in Southern California. And he was right. She really had some reluctance about doing it, and then arrived in Washington, D.C. in the middle of August. We'd been living on the beach in this beautiful house, and she arrived in Washington, D.C. looking for a rental in the middle of August. That was not the best introduction, but then we quickly made a lot of friends there. One of the houses that she looked at the first week was owned by Art Buchwald, and I really think that she thought that if Washington can be like Art Buchwald, I'm prepared to come.
Right. So when you were covering Watergate, did you actually think Nixon would ever resign?
I thought he was guilty, and I think that almost all of us in the White House press corps did. And I talked to a friend of mine the other day who was my kind of partner. Everybody kind of twinned up because the consequences were so enormous, and you had to check everything. And so my friend was a chess master from the Wall Street Journal, a really wonkish little guy, fabulous reporter. And here I was, a big television guy, not a chess player, but we shared information and tried things out on each other to make sure that we had it right. And about once a month we could get out of there and go over and have a hamburger, and they would have done something that day, and I would say something like, "Fred, it doesn't make any sense about what they've done today." And he'd say, "Until you remember he's guilty." And I said, "Oh yeah, then it makes sense." But the interesting thing is, we didn't go public with that. I didn't. At 7 o'clock at night, when I'd finished nightly news, I'd get on the phone and start working the sources for the Today Show the next morning. Now, if I got off at 7 o'clock during Watergate, Chris Matthews would be saying, "It doesn't make any sense what he did today, does it, Tom?" I mean, there would be a lot of opinion that would be coming into it. And I'm not picking on Chris, it's just the nature of the beast. In those days, and the other thing that happened in those days is that the print press was still, they really defined the culture. I had a couple of mentors, a wonderful reporter from Chicago by the name of Peter Lissagore, who was the best reporter, in my judgment, in Washington, could cover everything. And he kind of put his arm around me early on and said, you got to take a deep breath a lot of times. Just don't go with what the early speculation is. And then, of course, I think that Ben and Carl And Bob Woodward really also set the pace because everything they did was so airtight. There was not speculation. They'd nail it, and then it would be in the paper.
So the evening news, was it 15 minutes or was it going to 30 minutes?
By then it was a half hour. It was 15 minutes at the beginning. When I was in Omaha, it was still 15 minutes, and I was on it a couple of times, Huntley Brinkley. And then they decided, we're going to go to a half an hour, and they flew out a guy from Chicago because the Omaha station was one of their really reliable partners, and said, we don't know whether we can fill a half an hour or not, so we're going to need help. If you guys see something, let us know, because we'll need to fill it up.
So you're doing the evening news, you do your part from the White House, and then Dan Rather's doing his part for CBS. Did you ever worry that he had a scoop over you, or did your bosses ever call you and say, he has something, how come you don't have it?
Oh, sure, but I caught up pretty quickly, in part because there was just so much going on that it was hard to get something that was a big scoop of some kind. Dan did get the story of Nixon having phlebitis. That was a big story. I had a big story about 2 weeks after I was there of how the White House was continuing to manipulate reaction to the president's speeches by getting in touch with the National Association of Manufacturers and the banking and so on, claiming that they had never done that. And I stumbled across a memo outlining their plan for doing it, and that was front page the next day. So I have the highest regard for Dan as a working reporter. I mean, he was a tough, smart guy. And then we had the two of us had the last exchanges with Nixon in the White House. One of them was Dan just before me, and that was the famous one in which he asked the question of the president before the National Association of Broadcasters, and it got a lot of applause, that question. And before he answered just the preamble. And Nixon said, are you running for something, Mr. Rather? And Dan sharply and mistakenly said, no, sir, are you? And then there was a lot of booing. I was on right after that, and my question I'd worked on for 2 weeks. And I thought, God, nobody's going to be paying attention to this. And my question pivoted around the fact that Nixon claimed that he had executive privilege even during impeachment proceedings. And we went to Yale and all the major law schools in America, and even the conservative constitutional scholars said, no, it's not true. In times of impeachment, you do not have executive privilege. So I asked the president, and it turned out to be the last question that was ever asked.
Did you ever get a one-on-one interview, or he didn't do one-on-one interviews in those days?
I didn't do one-on-one with him in those days. The first press conference that I went to, that was the one that you still see it played a lot. He said to the effect of, I can't remember, the question was from Bob Pierpoint, I get the impression you don't like us, Mr. President. He said, you cannot like people that you don't respect. That was the first news conference that I went to. That was the tension that went on there. Now, having said all that, when he left office, he was working to reclaim his place. And I've left out an important part of my California days. Bob Haldeman I knew well before he went to White House and worked for Nixon. And after they'd been there for about a year, it wasn't working out well with Ron Ziegler. So Haldeman sent an emissary to try to get me to be the Nixon press secretary. It's a little known fact.
Wow, just think how famous you could be.
I almost threw up in my lunch when the guy put it before me, and I was not going to do this. And we kept it very quiet, and apparently Haldeman never, ever gave up on it. But the guy that he designated as his emissary said he's just not going to do this. So I turned 50, and they sent camera crews around, NBC did, around New York. And one of the camera crews came back, their eyes were about this big, and they said, you're not going to believe what we've got on tape. And we put in the player, and there was Richard Nixon in his blue suit and his flag, in Richard Nixon-like fashion, saying, I want to wish happy birthday to Tom Brokaw. I've always believed he was a man of very good judgment. He never showed better judgment than when he turned down my offer to be my press secretary.
Well, you can't beat that. So now you're finished Washington. NBC says, why don't you come and be the host of Today's Show? Did you want to pick up and move to New York and get up at 4 in the morning, or not?
I liked the Today Show because of the range. I'd actually had an earlier offer to do the Today Show, but in those days, the host still had to do the commercials, and it had no competition. That was the rise of Barbara Walters, and I was enormously fond of her and had a lot of respect for her. So they brought me up at that point as a tryout with a lot of other NBC correspondents, and I had a good week. It went well. Barbara and I got along. I had some kind of good lines, and we had stuff going on at the White House. And at the end of the week, they said, "We'd like you to do the Today Show." And I said, "I'm not going to do it. If I have to do Elpo ads, I'm not going to do this." And they said, "Well, it comes with the territory, and it pays a lot of money." I said, "I understand. I'm in the story of a life at the Watergate, and I'm not going to do that." Then what happened is, obviously, Nixon resigns. I'm still a White House correspondent. And they needed to make a change in the morning. And so they came to me and said, "You have to do this. You don't have to do the commercials, but we want you to do nightly news at some point." And this is the stepping stone to doing nightly news. And we wanted to come to New York. We liked New York, thought it'd be exciting for the kids to live here. And we had the advantage of moving here in 1976, when real estate, a lot of you will remember, was at rock bottom. So we were able to get a great apartment.
So you came here, and you do have to get up at 4 in the morning to do that show, is that right, or more or less?
I did the Today Show in a slightly different fashion than it's done now. I brought with me my political credentials and my determination to do that. ABC was starting with David Hartman, and they were very good. They gave us a lot of competition because the Today Show was kind of on autopilot at that point. But then that was, which quickly became the year of Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter running against each other. And preceding that, shots had been fired at the Holy Father in Rome. Sadat had been murdered in Egypt. And whenever anything happened in the world, I would get on the next airplane out of town and go there. So I brought a kind of sense of urgency in the morning to whatever was going on, wherever it was going on, and that got us back into #1 again.
So you did that for how many years?
I did it for 5 years.
5 years, and then they said it's your time to be the head of the news?
Yeah, I was going to leave, and I don't mean to sound immodest about this, but there was a lot of movement in the 3 networks at that point. Roone Arledge had come to ABC. He was trying to hire Dan. He was trying to hire me, and CBS was trying to change things around as well. So there were a lot of offers out there, and I wanted to stay at NBC. I had grown up on Huntley Brinkley. That's the only place I really wanted to work. Roger Mudd had come from CBS at that point to NBC with one of his former bosses because he was angry about Dan getting the job at CBS. And so Roger and I started as a team for a year, and it was notably unsuccessful. It just didn't work for a lot of reasons. And this NBC decided that they would stay with me. I was younger. I'd been an NBC person for a long time, and it was a very difficult time for Roger, obviously.
So you're the sole head of the NBC Evening News, and in that context, you did a number of exclusive interviews, and you, for example, you had, I think, one of the first interviews with Gorbachev. What was that like?
The first interview with Gorbachev, there was a big hot chase for that one. We had a fabulous guy working for us by the name of Gordon Manning, who was an old newspaper and magazine guy, and he had a friend in the Politburo in Moscow, and we poured more scotch down those members of the Politburo and treated them more prime rib in the best hotels in London or wherever we were in the world. Everybody was trying to get Gorbachev. And Gordon's connection paid off, and I got it. And it was the weekend before Thanksgiving. And so I flew over there to do the interview. Gorbachev we had seen him on television a lot at that point, and he was more winning even in person. He was very engaging, unlike anybody we'd ever seen in the Russian leadership. And we were putting microphones on him, and they were putting their microphones on him. And the typical Russia in those days, it looked like a bronze version of a clenched fist. It was just really ugly. So I was changing it. And I saw him staring at me, and I said, "Mr. Gorbachev," through the interpreter, "you must understand, I have to do this in my job every day." And he looked at me and he said, "You will not believe what I have to do in my job every day." And we became, as a result of that, we developed a real strong personal relationship. I haven't seen him for a while, but after he was dispatched from office, he came to New York. We had an evening with him, Meredith and I did, with some friends at the Waldorf. I always see him when he comes to town. I think he was one of the most important figures of the 20th century. He doesn't get the credit that he deserves, but he did change the world because he brought down the Soviet system. He hung on to the communist philosophy, the idea that that ideology could stay in place too long.
Now, he doesn't like when people say he presided over the collapse of the Soviet Union, does he? He kind of regards it as not a fair criticism.
Yeah, he does, although he's been now critical again of the attempts of Putin to bring back the Soviet system. He had a terrific group around him. There were a couple of them were World War II veterans. They'd been through Stalingrad. They were very smart. There were a lot of them. And then when he didn't move fast enough in their judgment, I actually wrote a piece for the New York Times in August, about 2 weeks before he was arrested, that his inner circle were beginning to drift away because they thought he didn't show enough courage about taking on the old communists. And as a result, he's just playing out his days. But I think historians will look back and have a very high regard for him.
He has a very quick wit, and I'll just tell you one story. Maybe I've told this group before. When he came to the Kennedy School once, he was asked by a student, how would the world be different if Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated in November 1963 and not John Kennedy? And without missing a beat, he said, well, you can't really say how history would change over 30 years, but one thing you can say for certain is that Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev.
Well, that's what I love about him.
So that's the Berlin Wall. You were there when the Berlin Wall went down. So what was that like?
Well, it was not as prescient as I'd like people to believe that it was. I was a Monday in New York, and we had a very good foreign editor by the name of Jerry Lamprecht. He came to me and said, there's not much going on here in this country. He said they're starting to, they're putting a lot of pressure on Czechoslovakia by going out through that gate. And he said, and I think we can get into East Germany. Why don't you go and just see what happens? So I said, that's a great idea. And I flew overnight to Berlin. And in fact, the next day I went through Checkpoint Charlie without any trouble at all and did a lot of taping and the kind of new but not complete optimism that you could see in East Germany at that point, in East Berlin. And we went on the air that night, but I taped it because I said there's no reason to burn all that money on a satellite feed. I don't have anything that urgent. But we had a satellite ordered. Now, this is the technical difference between then and now and how a big scoop happened. We kept the satellite order up for the next night as well. You couldn't just do it on a moment's notice. And so the next day, I went back into East Berlin again, and there was a lot of anxiety about what was going to happen, but there was nothing that was coming to fruition. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, there was a man by the name of he was actually the propaganda chief for the East, and he had a press conference, and he was a typical bureaucrat in those days, and he was muttering through things, and the East Germans were very unhappy. And they finally handed him a piece of paper, and he read it, and he said, now it is all possible the Politburo has decided for members of the GDR to go out through any gate in the wall and then come back. And it was a misinterpretation of what the GDR Politburo had handed him, the paper. They wanted him to apply for visas, and then you have to tell when you're coming back. He, in effect, opened the wall, not knowing it. That was broadcast across to East Germany. It turns out later that the whole Politburo had gone home and gone to bed. And so they were unaware of all this anxiety that was happening. I went up and interviewed him, and I said, read that again for me. And he read it for me again. I said, it means the wall is down. He said, yes, Doc, that's what it means. The wall is down. So we put that on the air. And it got quickly out of control. People started gathering at all the bridges and all the openings and everything. We had the satellite ready. I called New York and I said, the Berlin Wall is down. This is a historic moment. So we blew out the lights on everything, and I went out to the Brandenburg Gate, and the West German students were on top of the wall yelling at the East German students, come over, come over. East German students were not persuaded that was the safest thing to do. There were guards on the other side. They were hosing down people. And then at one point, they hosed down everybody except one guy who was standing on the wall. He had a leather jacket, and big smile on his face. He had his back to the water hoses. And I said to one of my colleagues, Martin Fletcher, go get him. I can see him on Time magazine next week, the new face of freedom in Germany. Martin came back about 30 seconds later and said, not quite what we think. And I said, what do you mean? He said, he's a drunk. He's been living in the forest. And he said, this is the first shower he's had in 2 weeks, so I don't think we want to put him on the air.
So usually the anchors of evening news shows don't leave voluntarily. It's like sometimes political figures, they just can't give up the job.
Right.
But you voluntarily left being the anchor. Why did you decide to leave at the height of your popularity and career?
Well, for two reasons. One, not quite as altruistic as it may sound, I really thought the next generation ought to have opportunities that I had as well. And it was becoming more and more confining. Every night you had to be there, and whatever the season was. I'm an outdoorsman. Some of the most important fly fishing is in the fall of the year. I'm a bird hunter. And I wanted the flexibility to go where I wanted to go, when I wanted to go. So I made the decision. In fact, I took the summer off to just kind of feel what it was like. Came back to New York, determined to leave. And thank God I came back. It was 9/11. And then 9/11 persuaded me I need to stay through the election of John Kerry and George Bush. So I stayed through that. And then I decided I wanted to write more. I wanted to have more flexibility to do longer stories. And
Let's talk about...
It becomes a kind of, David, it becomes kind of a golden handcuff, because you just can't go anywhere. You've got to be on alert 24/7.
So let's talk about something you've written. Before that, just talk about fly fishing, because not everybody here may understand what fly fishing is, and I don't really understand it either. You're trying to catch a little fish with a brain very small. Your brain is very big, so why is it so challenging? You're much smarter than that fish, right? What's the challenge in it?
Well, first of all, we fish are the canniest fish there are, trout in the American West, bonefish in the flats of the Bahamas. And then you're trying to persuade them that this artificial fly you're putting in front of them is something that they really want to eat. And you have to do it in a way that it seems like the same presentation that nature would have, that the fly lands on the water much as a mayfly would land as it came off the bushes and landed in the water. And there's a serenity about it, because you're out there in the water, you're trying to match wits with the trout, and it's all beautiful around you. And it's tough. I'm a good fly fisherman. I wouldn't say I'm an expert fly fisherman. There are days when I am expert, but you have to do it all the time. And it's very companionable as well. You love to go with your friends. And just like golfers remember every shot, we remember every fish that we've ever caught and why we did it.
But then when you catch them, you throw them right back, right? You
we
release them.
We release them, and it's called catch and release. And it's one of the greatest conservation developments in my lifetime. People used to catch 15 rainbow trout, take them home and eat them. I haven't killed a rainbow trout in 20 years. I killed maybe one by accident. But we just release them and put them back in, because the thrill is in catching them. Now, we have at the ranch in Montana a breeding pond where we have a spawning place for West Slope cutthroat, which are the native fish of the West. And occasionally we'll go out and get one of those and cook it.
So let's talk about your writing career. After you retired from being the NBC anchor, not CBS, NBC anchor, you wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. And where did you get that title, and where did you get the idea for writing that book?
Well, it's kind of a longer story, but I'll consolidate it. I remember World War II. I was born in 1940, and we lived on an Army base right away. To my dad, I was thinking about this the other day, he would go on these projects in New Brighton, Minnesota. Well, he was building an ammunition factory, and then he was in Hayes, Kansas. He was building an airfield for military use before we got involved in the war. That was Roosevelt getting things in place. So I was racing around the country as a tot with my parents. And then we ended up in an Army base in southwestern South Dakota, where they were storing ammunition and testing it 24/7. And so everybody around me was going to war, coming home from war. I wore a helmet, when I was 3 years old, and I just thought it would always be there. And then it wasn't. And then I caught the post-war wave of good jobs for our parents and thinking about sending us to college. And my dad bought very first new car, $1,700. I'll never forget, a bare-bone Chevrolet. And my mother had appliances she never expected to have. And then I caught my own wave personally and had these good jobs. And I went to Normandy for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. Yeah, this is gonna be a great story. But I was running a lot. I went to run in the hills. Great food there and great meals. The first day that I was there, I walked onto the beach with two guys from Pennsylvania who were in the Big Red One, First Division. I had to help one of them across the sand dunes. He lost both legs just before the war ended. The other one had earned a Medal of Honor. And we were right where they landed, and they both looked at each other and said, "We came ashore right there." I said, "That's right." I said, "What do you remember?" They said, "I remember that the ramp went down, and then our first sergeant and our lieutenant were shot through the head. We were 18 years old, and we'd only been in basic training, and we had to go on to the middle of this onslaught." And they were very calm, but very moved by it. And God, I was beginning to tear up. And then they described how they were behind a tank trap, and they said a colonel came running down the beach. And his name was Jack Taylor, I think I've got it right, who actually was quite famous for that day. He would lean over these terrified young American combatants, and he would say, "Men, there are two kinds of people on the beach, the dead and those about to be dead. You got to get up and get moving right now." And he saved a lot of lives by doing that. I was so shaken by that, I went back to lunch, and Sam Gibbon, who was a congressman from Florida, came over to me with a brass clicker that he had, and he clicked it, and he said, "Tom, Sam Gibbon." I said, "I know who you are. What are you doing here?" And he said, "I landed here 40 years ago. I was a lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne." And then he told this harrowing tale about being behind enemy lines, thinking the invasion had failed, terrified, putting together a squad. He began to cry. And his wife came over and said, "I've never heard these stories before." So that was the genesis of it. And I began to collect these stories, David. And then 10 years later, I used the phrase for the first time. I think it's the greatest generation anybody ever produced.
And were you shocked at the book's success? I mean, it became the #1 bestseller. It's been...
Yeah, they couldn't print it fast enough. Random House, they were printing all over the world at one point. I can't remember the exact number of about how many were being sold every 10 minutes. But there were a lot of funny stories. In Boston, Irish Catholic families went in the Marines. They responded to the call. And a Catholic mother, Irish Catholic mother, wrote to me and said, "Mr. Brokaw, I so appreciate your book. My children have now given me 12 copies. Would you just tell me where I can send them all?" It just touched a huge nerve. And it was written in 1998, and this is not an exaggeration. Meredith is my witness. I can't go anywhere in America without 3 or 4 times a week people coming up to me and saying, "I love The Greatest Generation." Most of them now are second generation, talking about what they learned about their parents. So I really do think I'm as proud of that as anything I've ever done professionally.
Well, you've been very involved in the World War II Museum and other things associated. The veterans have adopted you as their favorite journalist, I guess, fair to say. So did you think it was almost going to lead to a career of just being the Mr. Greatest Generation for a number of years? And did you do?
No, I did not. We honored David at the World War II generation. I always say to audiences, when it first started, Stephen Ambrose was going to make it the D-Day Museum to honor the man who built the landing craft because they were so critical of the war's success. And then Bob Dole and Danny Inouye came and said, "You have to make it the World War II Museum. We won't give you a lot of money, but that's what you need to do." So Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, who produced Saving Private Ryan the same month that I wrote my book, and we got involved. And I think David would agree with me. It is a phenomenal museum. I mean, it has exceeded every expectation that we had. Tom produced a wonderful film called A War Without Borders. It has 4 dimensions. You're in the theater and the chairs rock and the lights flash when there's an attack on a ship. So I really urge all of you, when you get anywhere near New Orleans, to go. It was helped by Katrina, oddly enough, because it was high and dry for the most part. And New Orleans had a lot of convention business booked, and most of them couldn't go anywhere because of the flooding, except they could go to that museum, and they have. And it's very moving, and it really tells you the big picture about what we went through.
So you wrote another book about an illness that happened to you, multiple myeloma, your disease that you contracted. Can you talk about how you realized that you had cancer, and when did you first realize it before you wrote the book? How did you contract it, do you think?
Well, I was of two minds. The summer that Nelson Mandela was dying, I had actually very active outdoors when I had biked across Argentina and parts of Chile earlier in the year. And then Meredith and I went to South Africa. She has a great project in Malawi where she's teaching women how to can tomatoes and make a business out of it. I was covering Nelson Mandela's death. And then we were invited by a friend to his place in Zimbabwe to spend some time. And I had this persistent backache. And it's not unusual for me to have that because of my lifestyle. And that's what the orthopedists who all looked at me said, oh, Tom, it's your lifestyle. You've been a climber and a skier and all these things. It just comes with the territory. It wouldn't go away. And I got to Rochester, Minnesota, where I was on the board of the Mayo Clinic at the time. And the orthopedist there said the same thing. I had a very wise, he was an internist. He was not a cancer specialist. Shouldn't last this long. And on his own, he drew some blood and he did an analysis in 3 hours, which all the oncologists said to me, this is unheard of for a man with that kind of training to nail that kind of complicated analysis. And at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he called me over to his office with an oncologist, and he said, I didn't know the guy was an oncologist, and he said, we want to share some things with you. And I sat there in the chair thinking about, I was working on the 50th anniversary of the documentary of the assassination of John Kennedy. I had a meeting that night. I had stuff to do the next morning for the board. Okay, let's get on with it. I thought they were going to say I had a parasite because I'd picked those up when I would go to the third world. And bing, 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 and they're talking about, what they're looking at, the bone marrow and other things. And then they turn to me, the oncologist says, you have a malignancy. It's called multiple myeloma. You know people who've died from this. Geraldine Ferraro died from it, and Frank Reynolds, the ABC anchorman, died from it. Those are the first words out of his mouth. But you're in pretty good shape. He said the lifespan is 5 years now, and we think that you should be able to beat that. But I want to take a look at some other things. I was of two minds. I was a journalist, on one hand. I was, craving more information. What the heck is going on here? And then I was also being very human. What does this mean? Does this mean I'm going to die of a cancer I've never heard of before, multiple myeloma? I really just bifurcated my reaction to it. And we had this very good discussion. My internist standing behind the oncologist, with whom I'd gotten very close, was looking at me with an expression of grave concern. So I knew that it wasn't quite as glossy as the oncologist was making it out to be. Went home that night and I had my laptop open where I was working on the Kennedy documentary, and I had an iPod open to see what multiple myeloma was. And it was the beginning of an ordeal, and I've learned a lot about being a cancer patient. And I must say to you that it has been for me a rewarding experience in a lot of ways about what families go through and what the medical community is able to do. And I don't think that the rest of us have a full appreciation of what that world is like until you enter it. And then when you enter it, in my case, every member of your family becomes part and parcel of that. My son-in-law's parents are here tonight, and he had to come over and help me at one point get turned in the bed because Meredith just couldn't do it anymore. I was so fractured in my spine. I had so many mini fractures that I had enormous pain. And I wasn't telling anybody about it because I didn't want to end up on the internet, Tom Brokaw, cancer victim. So I told my principal bosses and then my production team, I said, we'll have to work at home. I've got a bad back. I'm doing all this stuff. And we kept it pretty secret. Then when I finished the documentary, I had to go on David Letterman and Jon Stewart to promote it. And I had been on those broadcasts a lot. I knew that David, you just walked down the stage. You didn't have to step up, so I was going to be fine. But John, I was worried about because you had to do a big step up. And Meredith was very worried about me just going, period. And I practiced at home walking without the walker. And David went fine, and then the following Tuesday I went on John, and I said, I have to be seated before I can do the show because I've got this back. He said, I'm going to be fine. Back. Like 6 weeks later, or maybe 2 months later, it comes out that I've got cancer. And I immediately get an email from Jon Stewart who says, Brokaw, you are one tough SOB. I had no idea you had cancer. And I wrote back and I said, John, there was no reason for me to trouble you with my difficulties. He immediately emailed me back saying, Brokaw, you cannot be Jewish. If I had gas, I would trouble you with my difficulties.
So what is the state of your health now?
Well, my health is that I'm in remission and I'm holding up. I still have issues with my back because it does get in the bone marrow, and I had 4 bad fractures in my spine, and they had to go in and repair those, and I lost 4 inches of height. 4? And went from 6 feet to 5'8". That was very hard from me cosmetically. I find myself standing on my tiptoes when I'm having group pictures taken now. But after that, I'm fine. I had a long day of driving today, so I'm a little cranky tonight. But if I do my exercises and pay attention to my meds, I'm okay. And everybody on my medical team is saying it's looking good. Having also said that, there's some developments in cancer, period. And my pilot fish was a man by the name of Frank Lally, who lives in New York, and he's a senior journalist at Time Magazine. He used to be at the LA Times. He had it a year ahead of me. So he was kind of tracking things, and we shared doctor's references and so on. And he had his treatment was not going as well. So he got into a program called CAR-T, which is the new immunotherapy the Chinese have developed, of all things. And they're using it not just for multiple myeloma, but what it does, simply put, is it unleashes killer cells that go after the cancer cells. But it's not easy to get that done. And Frank got in a program down in Philadelphia, and he was in tough shape. He almost died a year ago. And at the end of the summer, his doctors are astonished at how they have reduced the cancer. And they are even saying it may go away at some point. It's too early to say that, and I wouldn't want anyone to walk out of here thinking, well, they're going to cure cancer with us. We don't know that. But that's the exciting part of cancer right now, is immunotherapy in a variety of these cancers. There are physicians in the audience, they know better than I do. And I have met amazing people. There's a great oncologist at Dana-Farber in Boston. Heather Landau is my doctor here at Sloan Kettering. I keep in touch with my friends at the Mayo Clinic. When cancer groups ask me to speak, I go down to MD Anderson and work with them on stuff. Because what happens, and I know I was a part of this, if you don't have cancer, you can be sympathetic. You cannot be empathetic until it enters you or your family. And then we need to get more people to understand what families go through and understand that.
What are the main projects you're working on now? What projects are you working on now? Are you working on
well,
new book?
I'm not working on anything specifically right now. I'm spending a lot of time on cancer. I will tell you that next week in Boston, I'm interviewing Joe Biden on his new book, which I reviewed for the Washington Post, and it's first rate. It's very, very moving about the death of his son while he was still vice president, trying to decide whether he should run for president. And he was very close to Bo and what they went through. And Bo had a terrible cancer and did not survive, but there were heroic efforts made at MD Anderson and in Philadelphia, and at the end at Walter Reed to keep him alive. But it was one of those situations in which, to put it bluntly, it was better for him to die because he was not going to have a life. I mean, he was completely comatose at the end and couldn't respond to anything. He had been this vital young man. And Joe wrote in his diary, my boy, my beautiful boy, died at 7:15 tonight. And anybody who's Republican, Democrat, Tea Party member, if you're a human being, you read that, you know what families go through.
Senator, Vice President Biden is very close to his children, was very close to Bo, but you're very close to 3 daughters. One of them was a doctor, and she helped you, as you point out in your book. What are your other daughters doing? What are your other 2 daughters doing?
Well,
one is a doctor.
My other 2 daughters are, my eldest daughter is a ER physician who, interestingly enough, as a result of her ER experiences, got very involved in end of life and how we don't manage that very well in this country. We're not honest in the hospital system, healthcare, or with families. And so she has tried to advance the understanding about how you deal with end of life. She's coming to Sloan to talk about it. She does it at seminars around the country. Born to be a doctor. Her nickname in medical school was Bombs Away Brokaw. She just cuts through everything. The middle daughter, whose in-laws are here tonight, is in the digital music and game business. And she used to work for Warner Records, and then when music went digital, she is in that. Do not ask me, or even her in-laws, to explain exactly what she does, because it's a mystery. She's on her way to Finland tonight, where she's doing some work. But it's the last thing that she did was that, as you know, music has really replaced movies for a lot of young people. That's where they get their entertainment. Andrea did the scoring for the music. She found the music that would go with the digital stuff that they were doing. So she's off to Finland tonight. Our youngest daughter, Andrea has 2 children, 2 daughters. Our eldest daughter has 2 daughters. Our youngest daughter is a therapist, and she does a lot of work with women. And wrote a book called Fortitude, about women in their 40s trying to make a decision about whether they wanted to continue careers or doing other things. They got a very active life in Southern California in this area. And she's got a podcast now that she's doing on Everybody Has a Secret. And she delivered the first boy in the family. She became a single mom. And she had a sperm donor. Sperm donor happened to be Chinese. So we have a Chinese-American little boy who is 4 years old, and he has conquered the family at this point. I mean, if you're a little boy with 3 aunts and 4 cousins who are all women, you can pretty much own the room when you walk in, and he does.
Final question. As you look back on an extraordinary career, what would you say you are most proud of having achieved?
Well, I think I'm most proud of, from a professional point of view, of having gotten it right for the most part. And when I didn't get it right, I was quick to say, we could have done better, or this is another way of looking at it. And then when you mix the two of them, the personal life and the professional life, I think I'm most proud of the fact that I have these fabulous daughters and sons-in-law and grandchildren and Meredith, that we've come through all these different layers, and we're still talking to each other, and
right.
And we're all together for Thanksgiving, and it's, that's what I stand back and look at that and think, my God, this is a long way from Yankton, South Dakota.
Thank you for a great career, and thank you for a great interview.